the ceasefire will be able to continue, I think is already in jeopardy, and that should lead us to be a little careful in our celebrations. But I do have to say, and the current sticking point is on the aid that's getting through to Gaza. That to my mind, obviously, the release of the hostages and detainees from both sides is an extremely important development, but even more, well, let's not be comparative. I'm most encouraged by the humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, where it has become a true humanitarian catastrophe in terms of the number of civilian casualties, the proportion of children being killed, the overall proportion of the population, which was 1 in 50 at this point, who've been wounded or killed in this conflict, and the spread of cholera and other airborne diseases, the lack of potable water, the lack of nutrition, the lack of medication, the lack of anesthetic, the lack of functioning hospitals, the lack of the fundaments of modern life, electricity, etc. It's hard to overestimate the degree of suffering being brought on the ordinary civilians of Gaza. And so anything that alleviates that is in and of itself a cause for celebration. I do have to then point to the deeper perspective from my point of view, and that is ultimately what leads to what are the small steps in the direction of some greater reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, between the ordinary members of their societies. And I want to be as careful as possible, creating a sharp divide between Palestinian and Israeli Jewish society is, I think, already solidifying the what is actually a quite porous interchange between those peoples, and many times in history, including quite recent history. But anything that brings reconciliation between the ordinary members of those societies, as well as between their governments, is the beginning of what's going to be a very difficult post-war process of trying to prevent ending up in the same situation again 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years from now. Anything that shows the benefits of a little bit of reconciliation, I think, is a step in the right direction. And I don't
Oh,
expect
how do I screen
that it's
share from
going to
here? I
be
can't do this.
Yes, you can.
dramatic movement
Oh, that's
in
what
that
I was
direction, but
Oh,
I do think
that was, you
well,
got.
that's what I just showed
computer.
you. I can't do this.
okay, so I'm muting everyone because obviously we're getting a little bit of background noise. As always, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask a question whenever you want to, make a comment, whatever it is. But so the core idea here is that what we need to keep in mind, even in the midst of a really brutal chapter in the ongoing difficult history in that region of the world, is the prospect for steps in the direction of reconciliation. And frankly, if the war resumes and becomes as brutal as it was 2 days ago, 5 days from now, then I suspect this is just a cisara, a temporary break. And what we've got to hope for is that this is the first step in the direction of eventual cessation of hostilities and then movement in the direction of greater reconciliation, some sort of stable, peaceful solution between these two peoples. Having said all of that, I won't go into the details. Obviously, we've talked about that at length recently. I'm going to continue today with our discussion of making democracy work better, a discussion that has, as the overall title suggests, philosophical, political dimensions to it, as well as concrete considerations of reform. I want to get today to some of those concrete considerations of reform. And so let me jump right in so as to be able to have time to get where I want to go. And I'll start by reviewing some of what we covered last week in a very synthetic or distilled way. So the idea that we face a choice as we recognize that in the third decade of the 21st century, there are growing forces opposed to democracy, whether you're looking at what's happening in elections in the Netherlands, in Finland, in Argentina, riots in Dublin that are anti-immigrant, right-wing, anarchico, or authoritarian populist riots. There's just growing signs that democracy in the world in the 21st century is increasingly brittle and threatened. And obviously, and I'll review the poll data that I shared with you last week. I think we have concerns about that in the United States as well. Having said all of that, how do we strengthen, how do we repair democracy in a moment of crisis? And I suggest two different approaches. They're not mutually exclusive, but having some sense of which one has the better prospects for uh, restoring some democratic faith, repairing the not only functioning of democracy, but the legitimacy and hence the commitment of people governed by democracies to their system of government, hopefully displaying to the rest of the world that democracy is capable of repairing itself and then uh, reigniting some hope for democratic reform in non-democratic places. The choice here is between essentially going back to the institutions that have been institutionalized in the name of democracy in previous centuries or decades and asking what can be done to repair them? How can they be made to function better? That's one possibility, right? So taking the house we have and working to stabilize it. The alternative is to work to innovate and create new and better democratic institutions to perhaps conclude that the problem with democracy in the 21st century may be traced back to the limits of the way in which democracy was institutionalized in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. And so rather than trying to repair intrinsically compromised forms of democracy, instead we should aim to better institutionalized democracy, to start anew, to experiment with new forms. And again, you can do both of these things at once, but human energy, time is, of course, finite and limited. And not only that, the project of reform is intrinsically difficult. And so, which one of these holds out the better prospects for restoring faith in democracy in a moment of crisis, I think is extremely important to try to ascertain. And so that's the big project of these lectures. I start from a basic diagnostic position, which is that in understanding the way in which democracy is institutionalized, there's a natural historical narrative repeated in civics lessons and the public culture of democratic societies, which is right, we had a revolution, we got a constitution, we fought a civil war, we amended the constitution to focus on those big historical junctures when society pivoted in the direction of democracy, often revolutionary or fundamental moments of crises. Having said all that, I would suggest to you that this popular narrative, in many respects, is misleading when it comes to the actual nature of democratization. It is a longer, slower, more gradual process animated by struggle, but struggle that doesn't always take the form of revolution or war or heroic reconstruction of institutions, but instead is more gradual, more incremental, depends upon the hard, slow, tedious work of reformers all across society, whether that's lawyers bringing ordinary suits that eventually transform the legal culture of a society, or novelists or composers celebrating a democratic ethos, the press holding our society to account for its failures to live up to its ideals, of course, social movements that work to unionize workplaces and create better conditions for economic democracy, or racial minorities, or women, or those who are discriminated against on other grounds due to their national background or sexual orientation, organizing to persuade the society that they too deserve equal rights and standing, that each of those moments is as important in the project of realizing democracy as was the revolution. Maybe I don't have to have equivalency there, but that we don't get democracy without that continuous struggle. And that in democratic societies, there's this dynamic tension in which, yes, we understand ourselves to be a democracy and to have had a democratic revolution, and yet our institutions, practices, forms of government, ways of life typically, almost invariably, fall short of our aspirations. And so we struggle. And by the way, those struggles are sometimes constructive, and the tension between our announced promise and our lived reality is sometimes constructive, but sometimes it's destructive. Sometimes it produces backlash, disaffection, alienation, and reactionary politics. And so uh, being attuned to the complexity of the struggle to better realize democracy seems extremely important if we're going to re-engage that struggle in the 21st century. And that then helps us to look at those moments in which the privileged are adamant about preserving those privileges, those moments in which maybe they're a little bit more open to sharing access to power, income, wealth, standing, and those moments in which the excluded and marginal are more or less successful in demanding greater equality and incorporation, and the critical role of those in the middle in determining who they're going to side with. Again, we need to be attuned to the complexity of this politics. I'm going to say one more thing, which I didn't say last week, but I think I should have said, and so I want to make it a real point of emphasizing this today, which is as we look at a coming year of presidential politics. We are now less than a year away from the next presidential election, which will happen in early November of 2024. I think that there's a basic shape to the struggle that is emerging, to the contest between, it appears, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I don't want to assume that the current political landscape is fixed and frozen. Many things can happen when you're talking about, on the one hand, one candidate facing 91 counts of felony, right? And who could very well be in jail by right September of next year. Another candidate who is in his early 80s, and if we look at the actuarials, there are serious health risks that he faces as well. But assuming that these two are the likely candidates to represent their parties and to fight it out for the nomination in the coming presidential election, it seems to me the fight is really a fight about, on the one hand, defending the current form of democracy against, on the other hand, an admittedly grave threat. And we're seeing more and more explicitly authoritarian rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump's mouth and campaign. He seems to be doubling down on his autocratic tendencies, and Joe Biden's apparent best strategy is to defend the United States against this threat to democracy. But in so doing, right, and I want to be as clear as possible, I don't see Joe Biden taking up the cause of making democracy work better. And it's funny because one way of synthesizing the difference between Trump and Biden is to say that Trump is the candidate of, again, of nostalgia, of backwards looking, of trying to restore some archaic sense of tradition, frankly more imagined than real, and that Biden is the candidate of better, of taking what we have and trying to work at the margins to continue to improve it. But I don't think he's really embraced the cause of making democracy work better. I think it's really much more about the economy. And here, the data that I shared with you last week suggests that that message isn't resonating, right? And I tried to give some analysis of why it isn't, just starting with the basic fact that Trump and Biden in a two-way race are neck in neck, that they're both as unpopular as presidential candidates get, and that frankly the playing field in the swing states in which this election will actually be decided at present seems to favor Trump, not Biden. And to offer a little bit of a diagnosis of why it appears that the groups that are essential to Biden's coalition, right, and African Americans, Hispanics, generally speaking, non-whites, are moving away from the Democratic Party or losing confidence in Joe Biden, that women too, that younger people too are moving away from the Democratic Party, that constituency, that coalition that Joe Biden has to assemble appears to be more difficult to assemble in 2024 than it was in 2020. And that part of the reason, it seems to me, that Biden's message is not resonating is that he's really trying to take credit for, quote, Bidenomics, for a middle out or bottom up program to economic reform, to creating jobs. And please note, credit where credit is due. Biden's administration, it coincides with one of the most robust periods of job creation in American history. And when you add that, by the way, his administration coincides with a pandemic and a period of sustained inflation, it's a remarkable accomplishment. But the benefits of that growing economy do not redound equally to all Americans. And as a matter of fact, many of the youngest people, many of the least well-educated people, many of the less affluent people in our society are not seeing those benefits come to them. And one simple way to capture this is to say that inflation has exceeded wage growth for almost the entirety of the Biden presidency. And so I want to say as clearly as possible, I don't think campaigning on Bidenomics is a winning strategy. I think it is frankly playing into Donald Trump's strong suit. I don't think I have the data here. Let me just check very quickly. No, I don't. But the data is very clear. By margins of more than 2-1, Americans believe that Trump is better at handling the economy than Biden. And I think, right, the data here again, very threatening to Joe Biden, that almost twice as many voters in 2023 say they are worse off today than they were a year ago, as opposed to saying that they're better off today than they were a year ago, and that there is an underlying cause to this, and that is simple. Our economy is so skewed in its distribution of wealth that the top 10% are taking essentially 2/3 of the wealth, that the bottom 50% have a negligible, almost vanishingly small proportion of the wealth. And so, even when the economy as a whole is growing and doing well, a large portion of the population feels not only left out, but that this is fundamentally unfair. And I think a fair bit of the rage, the anxiety, the resentment that boosts Donald Trump's standing in our polls, all those indictments and all of his problems notwithstanding, comes from that deep sense of economic unfairness. If Joe Biden tries to run on his economic record, he is running into a very strong headwind. And so, my fundamental suggestion to you is that Biden would be well served to change his argument to an argument of making democracy work better. First of all, obviously, face the threat to democracy that Donald Trump and the growing MAGA wing of the Republican Party represent to democracy. But second of all, also recognize that that threat doesn't come from nowhere. It's not fabricated. It comes from this data and the sense that democracy has stopped working for the ordinary person and is increasingly captured by the wealthy who use it to secure unfair advantages and seem completely indifferent to the suffering, the vulnerability, the precariousness of a large portion of their fellow citizens. They are dug in trying to preserve their privilege rather than extending the benefits that they receive to the rest of us. And as I pointed out, that's one of the variables that is necessary to take into account when looking at the prospects for democratic reform. So making that an issue in 2024, making it a question. Okay, we need to not take a wrecking ball to democracy, to the rule of law. We need to not split our society into true Americans and those who deserve persecution. And clearly that is a deep and important moral imperative. But we also need to make our democracy work better, to make it serve the interests, the needs, and the strongly reasoned convictions of the majority of the people. If we don't, then we will face, if not Donald Trump, Trumpism, populist, autocratic currents again and again in our politics. So with that in mind, I will just briefly review for you, right, two diagrams that we spent some time on last week. I won't try to represent all the details to you, but just to point out to you, I've referred to this sometimes as contemporary democracy faces almost a perfect storm, right? A large and difficult to surmount series of obstacles. I enumerate 19 of them, trying to synthesize the current political science literature on the impediments to democracy. I also then tried to point to you that there are a number of contemporary political scientists and commentators who are trying to distill from all of those democratic troubles a clear prognosis, I'm sorry, a clear diagnosis of the fundamental trouble. And that could be with the media and our lack of a shared reality, with our deep conflicts of interest and the incapacity of elections to handle conflicts that are so hard to manage. It could be with the fact that democracy just isn't delivering the goods anymore, and people won't support a political system that doesn't better their economic situation. It could be the degree of segregation in our society as we become a multiracial democracy, the degree of polarization in our parties, the absence of deliberation as we get more polarized and seem increasingly incapable of listening to the other side, or the fact that market actors have grown so much more powerful with globalization that they are increasingly simply dictating to political elites what they must do in order to avoid economic recession. And political elites are bowing to the markets and not presenting to the people choices that are meaningful and responsive to their interests and ideas. So all of that to say, right, that the move from here, right, 19 different and distinct impediments to here, right, 7 diagnoses to here, which is where we start today in terms of the new material, a single prognosis, a single recommendation. And I'm going to start with Daniel Zablat and Stephen Levitsky, who we have talked about many times before. And the authors of the book How Democracies Die, which was, I think, one of the guideposts for people trying to make sense of the Trump presidency and how to maintain democracy in the face of the threat that Trump presented. Levitsky is a scholar of Latin American politics, and in particular, Latin American populism and authoritarianism. And I think it's worthwhile noticing that right in the second half of the 20th century, probably the epicenter of authoritarianism in the world was Latin America, right? And so a very meaningful place to study if you want to understand 21st century authoritarianism. Daniel Zablat, a leading scholar, comparative politics of Europe, and in particular, modern Europe, Europe from the 19th century through the 21st century, and the rise of democracy and the role that conservative parties play in either bolstering or undermining democracy, which Ziblatt thinks is fundamental to understanding the stability or instability of modern democracy. So that's their background. Their most recent book, out just for a few months now, The Tyranny of the Minority, really tries to focus fairly exclusively on the United States from a comparative perspective and using many comparative cases. But the ultimate focus is what can be done in the 21st century to repair the 18th century creaky, increasingly dysfunctional constitutional machinery through which democratic aspirations are articulated and institutionalized in the contemporary United States. And as the title of the book conveys, their diagnosis of contemporary American politics is that actually a majority of Americans are welcoming of the transition into a multiracial, post-traditional democracy. They're not necessarily happy about the economics or all aspects of the present and future as we discern them in 2023, moving into 2024, but at least they continue to maintain fidelity to the idea that every person should be treated as an equal citizen, that they should have that equality expressed through an equal right to vote and through institutions that translate each person's vote into equal political impact on how decisions are made, how officials are elected. Having said all of that, they also immediately add that there is a large minority, and it is sometimes tipping in the direction of a small majority who are really opposed to the transition to multiracial democracy, to therefore the politics of immigration, but also the overall demographics and the increasing inclusion as equals of racial minorities, people who have been up until the very recent past excluded, marginal, vulnerable, enslaved, and that this minority wants to maintain the majority status of white Americans via excluding or disempowering or disenfranchising the growing number of racial minorities, people of color, and preventing what seems to be all but inevitable, the demographic tipping point to becoming a society with no racial majority, which seems really inevitable by the middle of the 20th century. They're also adamantly opposed to the transition to a post-traditional society, a society that is less religious, that is more open to experiments in living that include new ways of conceiving gender identity, new ways of conceiving sexuality, new social roles for men and women, and people who resist identifying with either of those traditional gender categories, etc. Right? And so their suggestion, and I'll make it as clear as possible as we get into this, is that the Republican Party has become the party of reaction, reaction against racial transformation, reaction against the movement into a post-traditional society, and that it attracts a vehement, threatened minority. And that generally speaking, if it's only a vehement minority, then democracy will work to ultimately manage the transition into multiracial, post-traditional democracy. But in the United States, we have institutions that amplify minority impact, and especially given the peculiar geography and political demography of the 21st century, those institutions serve to allow the Republican Party to see a path to power, to sustained political relevance and maybe even dominance without having to attract majority support, without having to rebuild a new coalition that reflects the movement of the United States into multiracial demography post-traditional culture. And so I'm going to review briefly some information that we've talked about before, and then get us into Levitsky and Zablat's recommendations. So the idea that the United States is becoming a multiracial democracy, and that the Democratic Party has reconceived itself as a multiracial coalition political party, is reflected in this data, which shows African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans voting dominantly for the Democratic Party. Part of the reason we worry about Biden in 2024 is that he's getting less support from these traditionally Democratic groups. White Americans are not quite evenly, but relatively evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, leaning more in the Republican direction. And you can see, right, the proportion of voters who are not white in the Democratic Party very closely mirrors the overall demography of the United States. The Republican Party has stayed predominantly 90% a white party as the United States has moved increasingly in the direction of racial diversity. And I think it's important to see that over the period of the rise of Trump that Democrats, white Democrats, have become much more racially progressive. They have, mainly speaking, a positive view of um, uh, African Americans. Very little by when, so that's 2012. This is 2016, right? I want you to see the movement in the direction of more Democratic whites having positive views of African Americans, much lower levels of racial resentment, whereas the Republican Party not only has much higher views of racial resentment, they are stable or, in fact, growing in the period of the rise of Trump, right? And so this is giving rise to racial polarization between the two parties, even their white members. One of the, I think, really important keys to understanding Donald Trump's rise and the way in which it has revived the electoral viability of the Republican Party is the way in which he has attracted those with racial or religious or sexual animosity into the Republican Party and identified the Democratic Party as the party of Blacks, Hispanics, Muslims, and gays, and therefore to be opposed, right? And so this is the animosity towards marginal groups as the key calling card of Donald Trump, and increasingly the key to the electoral viability of the Republican Party. I'm going to now very quickly shift from multiracial to post-traditional, and the way in which the Republican Party has become not only the party of animus towards marginal groups, but also the party of authoritarian maintenance of moral and cultural tradition. And so the first thing to see is that we are increasingly a post-traditional society. I've got some examples of this, which we've looked at together before, right? A larger share of Americans unmarried, a larger share of parents who are living together unmarried despite raising children, a decline in the percentage of people who are Christian, and a growth in the people who have no religion, rejection of binary gender identities, and rapid growth in the educational and professional accomplishment of women in our society. All of this then challenging the idea that we inherit the religion of our parents, that we adhere to traditional gender norms, that it goes without saying that you get married before you have children, or that women primarily play the role of caretaker while men primarily play the role of breadwinner. That is perhaps still culturally normative, but sociologically inaccurate in describing the United States. And for many of us, this is liberating and wonderful, but for many of us, this is deeply threatening. And it's not just that sociologically we're moving in the direction of a post-traditional society, it's that there have been these major social movements. The most important original feature of the politics of democracy over the last 50, 60 years have been these movements that have said essentially the traditional identities and norms of our society are unjust and illegitimate. So directly attacking the implications of the coercive enforcement of tradition as being illiberal, unfree, unequal, discriminatory, prejudice. And again, this amplifies the sense of threat to those who continue to make meaning by adhering to those traditions. And so this has generated status anxiety, and that is right? A very toxic sentiment or psychological position. There's a long history in political theory and science of looking at status anxiety, the sense, do I belong? Am I recognized? Are people like me respected within our society? Or are we viewed instead as archaic and unworthy and to be condemned? And if you find yourself in a position where you don't think your status, the position, the standing of people like you is socially respected, but you have been accustomed to being privileged, that is a very difficult position to inhabit. It typically leads to backlash, and that is certainly what we are seeing right now. But I would point out to you that it's one thing for tradition to be reproduced organically, taken for granted, voluntarily inherited by the next generation who sees in the values of their parents something that is natural, taken for granted, and worthy of respect and continuation. It's an entirely different thing when the reproduction of traditional culture does not occur organically and instead is imposed via the state, via the law, via coercion. And we are increasingly in that period, in that moment of a political battle over whether tradition will be reimposed once it's no longer being organically reproduced. And that if you believe that tradition needs to be imposed, you are not happy with liberal constraints on state action that protect and promote the autonomy of the individual to make her own choices about what values she wants to embrace and use to structure her life, as opposed to that you want the state to say, no, there's only one right way to do this, or at least certain forms of choice are not going to be available to you. And so it's not just right that anti woke politics has become so potent for the Republican Party and leads it increasingly into what is being described as Christian nationalism, right? We're going to remind our society that we're a Christian nation and then reimpose Christian values on our public life. It's not just right that that's a winning political strategy, at least for mobilizing this threatened sizable minority. It's also that this encourages authoritarian politics because the only way to reimpose tradition once large segments of your population reject the validity of that tradition is to by law force them into maintaining traditional roles. I think the politics of abortion, the politics of gender identity and reassigning gender identity, the politics of education and book banning all reflect the potency of this issue for a highly threatened, status insecure, and therefore readily mobilized minority of American society. So this then takes us into the increasingly ideologically homogenous nature of the Republican Party, in which these conservative ideas about maintaining the racial composition, the Christian nationalism of our society are widely shared by most members of the Republican Party. These ideas are extreme relative to most other political parties in the democratic world. It essentially makes the GOP ideologically an outlier party, a right wing populist authoritarian party where most of the mainstream parties of the democratic world are not in that territory. Though, if we look at what's happening in the Netherlands and Argentina and elsewhere, it is the case that those extreme parties are increasingly winning electoral viability. Let me not go into the full details of this quotation, just to synthesize the basic idea that we're in an era of so-called existential politics, where the question is not which policy we should prefer, but which kind of person should be granted full equality within our society, and which kind of person should be disfavored, should be marginalized, should be, if possible, disempowered, or have their way of life prohibited by law. And that is not a healthy place for a democracy to be. And this then gets us to what Levitsky and Zablat make the center of their diagnosis. And again, not to lose the forest for the trees, they suggest that in the 21st century, in which we have this animated, mobilized minority that is resisting the transition to a multiracial post-traditional democracy, we have in the United States institutions that actually cater to a politics that relies exclusively on this minority, because we have institutions that amplify minority power. So the first thing to see here is that parties that struggle to reconstitute their electoral base, this is sometimes called realignment. So the Republican Party, right, succeeded in doing this in the last quarter or so of the 20th century, in moving its base from the Northeast to the South, to the Bible Belt, as in particular white Southerners grew disaffected with their traditional allegiance with the Democratic Party. The Republican Party gained a new viable national coalition, relocating their primary geographic base to the South. That's a very hard thing to do in the middle of fighting elections. And the fact that they had Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, uniquely capable politicians, especially with Reagan's charisma, and faced a Democratic Party that was in many ways battling its own internal realignment struggles, allowed it to succeed. But this is not typical. More often than not, political parties fail to realign their base. And to be as explicit as possible, can the Republican Party in the 21st century get above 10% people of color voting for it? Can they get closer to mirroring the demographics of our actual society, reconstituting their policies and messaging to be more appealing to African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and to younger people, right, who are less traditional? And rather than trying to do that intrinsically risky work, we have institutions that seem to open a path to minority rule. And this is then the danger that Levitsky and Zablat are calling our attention to, the danger of a tyranny of the minority in the 21st century. What are those institutions? A bicameral legislature with an unrepresentative upper house with considerable powers. And so, right, Levitsky and Zablat, comparativists, they point out that many democracies in the 20th and 21st century chose unicameralism, parliamentary systems in which there's essentially only one house. Or if they have a second house, as the British do, a House of Lords, they have made it less powerful and increasingly representative. The United States has not revised the principle of representation in the Senate or the considerable powers assigned to the Senate by the Constitution in 100 years, right? The last time we had any reform, it was making the Senate popularly elected within the states as opposed to appointed in the early 20th century. And so that's one way. And I'll get into the data in a moment, but the Senate is an incredibly unrepresentative representative body, right? And so I think one way to put what Levitsky and Zablat are after is, quote, democratizing our democracy, trying to make our democratic institutions more democratic. The Senate, in addition to just being unrepresentative, it gives the same electoral power to Delaware and Montana that it does to California and Florida. The other thing to note is that there is all of this procedural nicety within the within the Senate that tends to further empower the minority. The filibuster is the clearest example of this. It allows a minority to block legislation favored by the majority. And so one of the questions to come back to the starting point, right? If Bidenomics has in equal measure succeeded and failed, succeeded in sustaining job growth in a tricky economic moment in American history, but failed in benefiting the bottom 50% of our society despite the job growth. And it's a hard case to make. You would have been more harmed had I not been president, as opposed to my presidency has clearly benefited you. The reason, or at least one of the reasons, that our economy works so disproportionately to the benefit of the already well off is because of changes in tax code and laws concerning unionization and the playing field between labor and capital, a whole set of legislative initiatives that I think a majority of Americans would like in the 21st century to reform. This experiment with neoliberalism has been tried. It has not worked to produce sustainable wealth and opportunity for most of us. We would like to undo the legislation that has created this experiment, but that is a non-starter given the way in which the representation in the Senate is constituted, and then the amplification of minority power by institutions like the filibuster. In addition to that, we have a president who is not elected by the majority of the popular vote, and twice already elected, in fact, people who have lost the majority popular vote in the 21st century, and who has veto power, and who therefore, again, can stop the legislature from passing legislation that may be quite popular. We have an unelected, unaccountable Supreme Court with judicial review, and so the capacity to invalidate legislation and reform that has majority support. And then we have federal systems a federal system in which the states design electoral rules, and that includes districting for the House and state legislatures, and so the possibility of gerrymandering. I'm going to say one more thing that I neglected to put on my list, which I think is extremely important. And that is that we have one of the most difficult to amend constitutions anywhere in the democratic world. So if the majority wants to change the features that block it from ordinary legislation, it is extremely difficult for it to do so. And so these institutions open the possibility of self-reinforcing minority rule. Minority gains power in a particular election and then gerrymanders and then appoints people to the Supreme Court who are likely to make unions less powerful, to make it more difficult to combat gerrymandering, make it more difficult to enforce voting rights legislation, et cetera, and so on, right? And so we get a self-reinforcing dynamic in which the or disproportionate representation of minority power allows that minority to continue to hang on to power despite the fact that their views do not represent the majority of Americans. And this possibility, a possibility of ruling without consistently attracting a majority of popular support, the possibility of using those moments when you gain power to solidify your capacity to rule via minority amplified power has been embraced by one of our two main parties, at least by a large portion of its leadership. And this is then pushing that party in an anti-institutional authoritarian direction that is the threat of 2024. So I have given you the diagnosis. I'm going to stop there and open us up for questions. We've gone nearly an hour so far, and I do want you to have a chance to discuss. I promise with you, share the recommendations of Levitsky and Zablat at the beginning next week if we don't get to them this week. Anybody want to start us out with a question or a comment? Flossie, please remember to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
What I saw most recently this morning was one of these Thanksgiving shopping riots. We have got a lot of men running into stores.
Oh, Flossie, you cut out for a second. Hold that space bar down, please.
Yes. So a lot of these riots with hooded men, and it would appear that the hooded men are naturally Black citizens. That may not be the case. They're also being called the Palestinians. Depending if it's in LA, it could very well be even some of the Israelis dressing up. So you don't know who's committing the crimes now. And if you've got a social media that loves to play games with people's emotions, you don't know whom to trust anymore, especially if you're uncertain. And I'm
Yes.
beginning to see that happen. That's one thing.
So
And then
Flossie,
you have a situation where an organization like Kaiser wants to give all of its minorities the opportunity to practice medicine. And so we have nurses who are the RNs, but LVNs, practicing dressing wounds and being very particular that they get the respect that you once gave to doctors. And that can be very difficult when you become a patient and you rely on a new society to whom you must give respect, otherwise you are in danger. I just leave you with these happy thoughts.
all right, Flossie, and I have to admit I'm unaware of the Black Friday or Saturday riots that you're describing. So I'll do a little bit of research before I try to talk about that in any way. But I do want to point out that in describing this, you also described the way in which disinformation circulates so readily in our digital public sphere, where social media, many to many, anybody can take a picture, right, including a picture of something they didn't take a picture of, but of something they see on their TV, they see in their newspaper, and then narrate it in whatever way they want to, put it out on a social media platform that is organized by an algorithm that doesn't verify the truth of what's being said, but in fact rewards the post that attracts the most attention, which is typically dictated by the strength of the emotion, not the truth of the content. And then off we go to this viral spread of stuff that may be completely false, but equally inflammatory, right? And so I do think part of the danger in our historical moment is that democracy, and I am a deliberative Democrat, I do believe that although we need to be passionate and compassionate, sympathetic with others, angry at injustice, that the role of emotion needs to be balanced by a capacity to offer arguments, to reason, to listen to each other's reasons, to respond in kind, and ultimately to try to respond to the force of the better argument. And that our current media sphere discourages the underlying disposition to listen to hear, and to respond respectfully to each other. And so it sounds to me like maybe there's just a new chapter in this from what Flossie is saying. I'll just add to what you said about medical care, Flossie, and I'm not, but I have relatives who are in the Kaiser system. That what you're describing sounds to me not only like a Kaiser problem, but a problem with the American medical system. And for the last couple of months, I've been dealing with some health crises with my father. And one of the takeaways from this is just how broken this system is. And I'm not going to say that it's not perhaps Kaiser's commitment to racial equality, but I do think that there's something else from what I know going on, which is an effort constantly to cut costs in order to increase profits. And that means transferring whatever labor can be transferred from your higher paid to your lower paid employees. And so the idea that doctors are scarce and nurses and physicians' assistants are more plentiful is a byproduct of a medical system that is governed by the profit principle, as our medical system is in the United States today. Anybody else want to talk about the amplification of minority power built into our 18th century institutions? And please note, this is not accidental, right? This was seen as diffusing the dangers of democracy. I think it's worthwhile noting that our founders, when they got together in Philadelphia in 1787, basically agreed in their diagnosis that a large part of the problem with American politics in the post-revolutionary period wasn't, quote, excess of democracy, right? And so let's check, let's balance, let's constrain the people who are overly passionate and overly empowered in the aftermath of the revolution. And here we are 240 odd years later, still wrestling with the checks on the power of the majority, which effectively amount to a relative empowering of the minority. Is that the heart of our political problem? That's at least what Levitsky and Zablat are suggesting. Any thoughts or disagreements, concerns about that diagnosis? Any other questions or comments for today? All right. Well then I'm just gonna say um happy holiday. A little bit after the fact, but we're coming into the holiday season. Happy holidays. And I promise you I will start off next week with a sustained discussion of the recommendations for reform from Levitsky and Zablat, so that you've got not only a sense of their diagnosis, but their cure. All right, everybody, be well, take care, and see you all next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.